Hello, my name is Ashley Edes, and I would like to tell you about some recent research I conducted, along with my colleagues Barbara Wolfe and Doug Cruz, on allostatic load and social relationships in female gorillas housed at the Columbus Zoo. Most of us are very familiar with the concept of stress and how it can affect our lives. For example, we know that experiencing higher amounts of stress negatively impacts our bodies, leading to somatic damage that can later cause illness, promote the development of chronic disease, and even shorten lifespans. The internal damage that accumulates due to stress is known as allostatic load. We can estimate this allostatic load using something called allostatic load indices. These allostatic load indices are composites of biomarkers from multiple systems throughout the body. For example, most allostatic load indices contain biomarkers from neuroendocrine, cardiovascular, metabolic, and immune systems. What the allostatic load index does is estimate the amount of somatic damage by counting the number of biomarkers that are considered dysregulated. In essence, the more biomarkers you have that are dysregulated, the higher your allostatic load. In humans, allostatic load has been studied for a couple decades and is associated with a number of variables. For example, individuals who are older, have lower socioeconomic status or lower educational attainment tend to have higher allostatic load. And then we know that that higher allostatic load does translate to poorer mental and physical health outcomes, including increased risk of mortality. While allostatic load indices have been used in studies of humans for the past 2 decades, they're rarely incorporated into primatology despite our long focus on stress research. So my colleagues and I decided to develop the first allostatic load index for Western lowland gorillas using 7 biomarkers. We included albumin, corticotropin-releasing hormone or CRH, cortisol, dehydroepiandrosterone sulfate or DHEAS, glucose, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. We then applied this allostatic load index to gorillas that are currently and were previously housed at the Columbus Zoo. Some of the biomarkers, such as albumin and glucose, were available in zoo medical records, but others had to be assayed from banked serum. So we assayed 1 serum sample per gorilla, and that serum was banked during a previous physical examination. Now, because we were using banked serum, we were able to estimate allostatic load even in gorillas who are now deceased or have been transferred to other zoos, which gave us a larger sample size than we would have had if we were limited to just the gorillas currently housed at Columbus. Before getting into our results, I will briefly describe how allostatic load is calculated, but please feel free to email me if you have any additional questions. We followed the traditional methodology for calculating allostatic load, which is to use quartile cut points. So what we do there is take the sample distribution for each biomarker and we divide it into quartiles. Now, for albumin and IL-6 in our sample of gorillas, there were significant differences between males and females, so we used sex-specific quartiles for those 2 biomarkers. In order to get an allostatic load score, we then added up all the biomarkers that were considered high risk for an individual. Because we have 7 biomarkers, scores could range anywhere from 0 to 7. If a gorilla got a score of 0, that would mean they had absolutely no biomarkers dysregulated to the point that they would be considered high risk. And if we had a gorilla with a score of 7, that would mean all of their biomarkers were dysregulated to the point that we would consider them to be high risk. And then, of course, gorillas can fall in between anywhere on the spectrum. So what we do is we just sum up the number of biomarkers that would be considered high risk. Albumin and DHEAS become dysregulated on the lower end, so the first quartile was considered high risk for those biomarkers. For CRH, glucose, IL-6, and TNF-alpha, those are considered dysregulated when they're too high, so we use the top quartile for high risk for those biomarkers. And then cortisol can become dysregulated in either direction, so we used a split quartile, meaning that we counted values either in the bottom 12.5% or in the top 12.5% of the distribution as being high risk. And so then once you add up the number of high risk biomarkers each gorilla has, you get an allostatic load score or estimate for each individual, and you can use those scores to conduct your analyses. We are actually in the process right now of finishing up analyses on a much larger sample of zoo-housed gorillas, but this slide highlights our original findings from our pilot study. We observed a range of 0 to 4 in the gorillas housed at the Columbus Zoo, meaning the gorillas had anywhere from 0 to 4 biomarkers that were dysregulated to the point of being high risk. We saw significant associations between allostatic load and a number of variables that closely correspond to results that we see in human research, such as age, sex, rearing history, stressful events, markers of morbidity like creatinine and triglycerides, and with mortality risk. What drove the particular project that we're going to get into now is this difference here that I've highlighted with the circle. There is a big difference between males and females in terms of allostatic load. As you can see from this slide, females have significantly higher allostatic load than males. In fact, that difference is more than twofold. And so I immediately wanted to know what was causing this difference. It's not uncommon in human samples for either men or women to have higher allostatic load depending on the sample in question. But I really wanted to get at this question of what is causing female gorillas in the Columbus Zoo sample to have higher allostatic load than male gorillas. Being a primatologist, I immediately started thinking about the sociality that gorillas exhibit. And we know that silverback gorillas can be aggressive toward females. It's something called courtship aggression, and primatologists believe it may function in group cohesion. Females seem to be more likely to mate with males who clearly and regularly demonstrate their strength. However, even though females are likely choosing more aggressive males intentionally, that aggression may still be stressful if they experience it. Gorillas are the most sexually dimorphic primate species, and males are approximately twice the size of females. So while mating with a stronger, more aggressive male may mean increased protection for your offspring in case of predation or infanticide risk, a female doesn't necessarily want to be on the receiving end of those courtship aggression displays. So in the wild, primatologists have noticed that females tend to maintain a safe distance from the silverback unless they're in estrus or have young dependent offspring that need protection. And in addition, the forests where gorillas live tend to be so dense, or the trees tend to be so dense that visibility is really limited. So both the distance and the reduced visibility may help limit the likelihood for wild females to experience courtship aggression. For females living in zoos, however, they may not have the options of distance or limited visibility, and so they may be at higher risk of receiving courtship aggression from the silverback. They may even just perceive being at higher risk of this courtship aggression. And that increased risk, we think, may generate a sort of low-level awareness or stress that results in higher allostatic load over time. So what we hypothesized is that if we measured proximity to the silverback, that we would see a significant association between the amount of time females spend in proximity to the silverback and their allostatic load. To test this hypothesis, we conducted proximity observations of the 3 breeding groups that are currently housed at the Columbus Zoo. Per the typical gorilla standard, we defined proximity as being at or within 5 meters. For each female, we then calculated the percentage of time she spent in proximity to the silverback out of the total time that we observed her. Now, depending on the group and the particular individual, we recorded anywhere from 60 to over 1,400 proximity measures per gorilla. Now, some gorilla groups were out all of the time, but for some other groups, there were some infant births going on, and so gorillas had a lot more choices as to whether or not they were on public or whether they were out in the public viewing area. And so for some gorillas, we don't have as many data points. And then we used a linear regression to determine if there was a relationship between the amount of time females spend in proximity to the silverback and their allostatic load. What you can see in this chart is that we observed a significant relationship between the percentage of time a female spent near the silverback, shown on the x-axis, and her allostatic load, shown on the y-axis. The more often a female is within 5 meters of the silverback, the higher her allostatic load. Now, this sample is small, but the regression shows approximately 47% of a female's allostatic load can be explained by the amount of time she spends in proximity to the silverback. Now, the majority of studies on animal welfare suggest that performance of species-typical behaviors is a gold standard. However, it's possible that some species-typical behaviors, such as males exhibiting courtship aggression, are stressful to other members of the group, in particular females who lack species-typical coping strategies. In this study, we have observed that females who spend more time in association with silverbacks have higher allostatic load. Now, while we cannot determine causation, it is possible that increased proximity to the silverback puts females at higher risk or even just higher perceived risk of receiving courtship aggression. So even though courtship aggression is a species-typical behavior for males, it is likely a stressor for females, and some zoo enclosures just may not be arranged to permit females to engage in their species-typical coping strategies, such as increased distance or reduced visibility, and that might result in higher allostatic load for females. As we know from human research and from the results of our original pilot study, having a higher allostatic load is associated with indicators of poor health, such as increased circulating triglycerides and creatinine, as well as increased risk of mortality. While research is underway to further validate this relationship, there are a few possible solutions that may be explored in the near future. For example, zoos may be able to make affordable changes to husbandry and management that may give females more choices over how close they are to the silverback. For example, Nadler conducted reproductive studies using restricted access arrangements, where females had access to areas that males physically could not enter. What Nadler observed is that females would routinely stay away from silverbacks unless they were in estrus. More recently, Curtis, Wagner, and Ross examined the effect of providing simultaneous access to both indoor and outdoor spaces to gorillas housed at the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago. And what they observed is that when they provided access to both indoor and outdoor spaces at once, this allowed the gorillas to put more distance between themselves, which is a strategy that gorillas typically use to avoid conflict. In addition to these possibilities, we may also want to examine how providing visibility barriers within the enclosure might benefit females. While many zoo enclosures are designed with openness in mind for public viewing, it may be possible to add a few small structures that can permit females to reduce visibility and potentially their perceived risk of courtship aggression. Of course, overall, the goal of all of this research is to provide greater insight into questions of health, welfare, and longevity, and we are looking forward to examining the associations between allostatic load and social relationships in a number of zoos in the near future. If you have any questions or comments about this research, I do hope you'll reach out to me. My contact information is there on the bottom of the slide. We'd like to thank our research assistants as well as the keepers and veterinarians at the Columbus Zoo, and funding for this research was provided by both the Columbus Zoo and the Department of Anthropology at The Ohio State University. Thank you for your time.